Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, imagine it's the year 112 AD, and a Roman road inspector named Publius has just woken up in his modest villa outside Londinium. His morning begins, as always, with a sigh, a stretch, and a quiet meditation on the eternal mystery. Why do the geese honk precisely when his wife opens the shutters? Publius is not a glamorous man. He doesn't command legions, recite odes to emperors, or recline at banquets draped in purple. No, Publius oversees the Via Flaminia's less glamorous cousin, the Via Boringa. It connects two towns you've never heard of, and to be fair, neither had most Romans. His job, road maintenance. Glorious, uneven, rain-soaked road maintenance. Now, to understand the wonder of Roman roads, we'll need to lift the veil very gently, like turning pages in a folio too old for sunlight. You see, these roads weren't casual dirt trails or goat crossings dressed up as public works. They were serious, stone-built, meticulously observed masterpieces of Roman logistical obsession. Beneath the surface of your average Roman road were no less than 4 distinguishable layers. The statumen, a foundation of stones, because naturally even the ground must have armour. The rudus, a layer of gravel and mortar, probably stirred by a cohort of disgruntled conscripts. The nucleus, a kind of concrete paste, always sounding tastier than it was. And finally the summa crusta, the paving stones, the part you'd actually walk on, trip over, or regret kneeling upon barefoot. The Romans didn't mess about. These were roads for marching legions, messages from emperors, and the occasional olive oil merchant with a wheelbarrow full of pots and opinions. And yet, for all the conquest and grandeur, the real victory lay in their maintenance schedules. Which brings us, tenderly, to our good friend Publius. On this particular day, he was donning his road inspector's cloak, undyed wool, which is to say, it was fashionable in exactly nobody's opinion, and heading to milestone number 33, where a suspicious puddle had been reported by an elderly merchant with strong feelings about gravel. Publius had a wax tablet with today's checklist: inspect erosion, reinforce retaining wall, and kindly ask that the nearby sheep cease using the drainage trench as a spa. Upon arrival, he examined the puddle with the seriousness of a man contemplating both water and province-wide disgrace. For in Rome, proper roads weren't just a convenience, they were proof that you belonged to something eternal. Civilization did not tolerate soggy sandals. "Ah," Publius muttered, poking at the troubled spot with his stylus. "This is not a puddle. This is the whispered beginning of a scandal." He called in 2 maintenance slaves, Julius and Marcus, who, having hoped for a day composed mainly of loitering and philosophical sighs, were disappointed to find themselves immediately re-gravelling. They began with the classic Roman pickaxe shuffle: 2 strikes, 1 complaint, then lunch. Meanwhile, Publius filed a minor incident report, complete with miniature sketch, noting the erosion was aggressively meek, but deserving of moderate concern. Having dealt with the puddle and reprimanded the sheep with all the authority middle management can muster, Publius checked off his duties for the day. He would now return home, sip watered wine, and listen to his neighbour drone on about lumbar support in ancient wagons. Above all, it was another quietly triumphant day in the Empire's earnest quest to keep the world under control, 1 stone at a time. So as sandals echoed on carefully paved lanes under a sky thick with laurel-scented breeze, we leave our diligent inspector sharpening his stylus by candlelight, still pondering whether sheep intentionally choose chaos. Thank you for wandering with me through the cobblestone corners of Roman efficiency. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, as the aquiline sun slipped like a gold coin behind the hills of Latium. Let us turn our sandals toward the very practical heart of Roman genius. Not emperors, nor legions, nor even the occasional toga-related scandal, but the humble, ever-unfolding expanse of the Roman road. Now picture this. You're a Roman foot soldier. Let's say Marcus. It's the year 16 AD. You've just marched 23 miles in sandals that offer the arch support of a decorative salad plate. The good news? You're walking on Via Appia, one of Rome's finest roads, and you're slightly less miserable because of it. The Via Appia, the Regina Virum, Queen of Roads, was among the earliest and most important of Roman highways, stretching so straight and proud across the countryside that some say it could have been drawn with a divine ruler. It began in 312 BCE, when Appius Claudius Caecus, a man with a name so powerful it sounds like it should echo in a cave, ordered its construction, not because he loved infrastructure, but because he wanted to outdo a political rival. Naturally. But here's the secret no one talks about while dozing off in history class. Building the road was just the beginning. Maintaining it, that was the real drama. The Romans, obsessive as they were about aqueducts, sanitation, and debating in sandals, knew that greatness isn't forged in marble, but in long, uneventful projects involving gravel. Road maintenance in ancient Rome was a surprisingly layered affair. First, there were the layers. A typical Roman road wasn't just a path, it was a geology lesson. There was the statumen, or base layer, like the crust on a very unpleasant pie, made with large stones. Then the rudus, a middle mixture of gravel, sand, and magic Roman ambition. Next came the nucleus, a finer layer of compacted concrete-like material. And finally, atop it, the summa crusta, the surface layer, often made of neatly fitted paving stones that could survive armies, ox carts, and the occasional inebriated senator trying to reinvent the concept of speed limits with a chariot. But like all well-meaning projects, things fell apart when they were left to someone else. To keep roads like the Via Appia from crumbling into glorified goat trails, the Romans had a well-oiled bureaucracy. And by well-oiled, we mean oiled with actual olive oil. Officers called curatores viarum were given the thankless task of overseeing road maintenance. These were men of high rank, because in Rome, even your pothole inspectors had resumes that included minor deities and poetry recitals. Below them slaved a small army of workers and local contractors, the redemptores. Their job was to handle repairs, often using local materials and labor. Unfortunately, some of them skimped on quality, thinking no one would notice if they swapped volcanic stone for whatever happened to be lying around, like petrified sun-dried tomatoes. That's when the Romans created a system of fines, inspections, and the occasional passive-aggressive mosaic. Then, of course, came the road's rustic nemeses, tree roots, overflowing wagons, and those charming seasonal floods, all capable of reducing months of finely compacted gravitas to something resembling a medieval stew. And if you're wondering how often these roads were maintained, well, picture a Roman official mounting a very solemn inspection while trying to stay upright on an unhappy donkey. These inspections were irregular, not because they wanted them to be, but because the empire was vast and travel time was unpredictable. You'd think with all these perfect roads, they could get somewhere faster. But as every Roman knew, road quality does not stop a rainstorm, nor an ox with performance anxiety. City roads got more attention, especially in Rome itself, where senators didn't enjoy bouncing over potholes on the way to scold the plebs. The urban roads even had sidewalks and drainage ditches, albeit often clogged with mysterious substances that no historian has dared chemically analyze. Still, the system worked, remarkably so. Roads were maintained for centuries, which is why some of them are still walkable today, with the occasional selfie stick serving as the only modern addition. And as the moon now rides high above an ancient landscape of cobblestones and forgotten milestones, we let our thoughts drift to another corner of the Roman world, where gladiators polish their swords and amphitheaters whisper of marble and mischief. But we'll get there. After all roads lead to Rome, eventually. By the time the Romans got around to building roads, they'd already done a lot of other things first. Conquered, paraded, invented concrete, and made the fine art of bathing a full-time social event. So when they finally said, "Let's make roads," they did it with the kind of unimpressed confidence of someone folding laundry while quoting Virgil. It began with a simple question asked by thousands of sandal-clad engineers. How can we move legions, letters, and amphorae of fish sauce more quickly through our expanding empire? The answer, it turned out, involved layers of stones, mathematical angles, and a surprisingly obsessive relationship with drainage. Romans weren't just good at building roads, they were unreasonably good. And tonight, as the stars hang like sleepy olives over the eternal empire, we'll explore how the Romans mantled, and more importantly, maintained, their noble highways. To begin, imagine a Roman surveyor, known charmingly as a grammaticus, because naming yourself after a thing that measures angles seemed like the right move in the 2nd century BCE. Picture our friend Gaius the Grammaticus, in a linen tunic slightly too short for present-day modesty, squinting into the sunrise over a field in Gaul. He holds a large wooden cross called a groma, an engineering tool that looks like the unholy union of a weather vane and a coat rack. With this peculiar device, he aligns vertical plumb lines to determine straight paths. Because in Rome, as in bedtime, direct routes were sacred. The path set, construction began. First came the digging, a trench as wide as a modern driveway and as dramatic as a Roman drama. Into this channel went sand, gravel, crushed stone, a layer of concrete, and finally the neatly placed basalt paved surface known as the summum dorsum. It sounds like a spell from a dusty wizard, but in fact, it simply means the top back. And yes, Roman roads had spines, so did many of their users occasionally. But building a road is one thing. Maintaining it, that's where the real bedtime-worthy magic happens. The empire, understanding that a crumbling road could lead just as surely to rebellion as a high wine tax, appointed officials known as curatores viarum, caretakers of the ways. These gentlemen supervise maintenance in their assigned regions, a bit like regional managers, but with togas, scrolls, and fewer motivational posters. If we peek softly, as though not to disturb their marble busts, we can hear the curators assigning tasks to local labourers, often funded by the massively wealthy in exchange for political brownie points. You see, in ancient Rome, fixing a road earned you both divine favour and civic clout. Contributing a lovely culvert could be the 1st century equivalent of naming a library wing after your Aunt Flavia. The labourers themselves performed everything from patching potholes to rebuilding toppled milestones, mile markers that also happened to be propaganda. These inscribed stones listed who commissioned the road, how long it stretched, and whose glorious reign made that pothole-free morning commute possible. Problems, of course, occurred. Heavy rains in the provinces turned gravel into goop. Army wagons overloaded with particularly determined sheep would buckle the path. Occasionally, an enterprising local built a tavern too close to a roadside bathhouse, resulting in traffic jams of togas and drunk philosophers quoting Plato incorrectly. But every year, wherever the roads grew weary, repairs arrived, sometimes funded by the emperor himself, whose name would be etched lovingly and permanently into the freshly laid stones, ensuring the next 1,000 donkey carts knew who to thank. And wherever soldiers travelled, they carried more than javelins. Many bore spades and picks. They weren't just invaders. They were part-time engineers called upon to patch a road between skirmishes or clear out a culvert after an unusually passionate thunderstorm. It's the kind of multitasking that would make any modern contractor weep gently into their hard hat. So tonight, as your head rests gently where no Roman helmet ever dared lie, imagine the quiet clink of basalt being arranged centuries ago. Roadwork by torchlight, conducted under the same stars you see now, perhaps a little hazier with time and city smog. And just beyond that dreamy horizon, where the Via Appia fades into twilight, someone stands ready to post a milestone, wipe their brow, and carry on. Soon, we'll follow the carts and clatter into the curious world of Roman roadside amenities, comfort stations of the ancient world, where tired sandals sought solace and senators paused for snacks. But for now, let's let the surveyor rest and the stone settle. We begin, as all great odysseys into the world of gravel and lime mortar inevitably must, by peering into the daily affairs of the cursus publicus, Rome's imperial postal system, which doubled as a sort of ancient Yelp review platform for road conditions. You see, when your empire spans 3 continents and your sandals haven't been upgraded in over a decade, the last thing you want is to turn your collection of goat-derived scrolls into a blistered, road-weary courier's sob story. The Romans did not suffer bad infrastructure lightly, nor silently. The cursus publicus, essentially the Wi-Fi of the Roman Empire, but slower, louder, and delivered by someone riding a sweaty horse, relied heavily on the condition of Rome's roads. If the stones were out of alignment or the ditches clogged with too much triumphal detritus, say confetti from a recent victory parade or an ill-placed statue of Mars, word got back fast. And that word was, fix it, or else. So who, you might wonder, was responsible for patching potholes along the Appian Way, while sipping diluted wine and mumbling about the glories of the Republic? Enter the curatores viarum, road magistrates. Appointed with solemn ceremony and a somewhat disconcerting amount of sarcasm from their peers, these officials were tasked with overseeing the maintenance of roads, bridges, and occasionally roadside inns that smelled like wet olives and regret. Now, it's comforting to imagine the curatores out there, cloaked in togas and wielding golden shovels. But in truth, they did what supervisors have always done best: delegate. Beneath them, a complex web of contractors, slaves, and conscripted locals did the actual shoveling, paving, and chirping cheerfully. Red, grumbling profusely about the indecisiveness of command. Let's indulge in a sleepy meander toward one such crew, shall we? Beneath the dappled olive trees of rural Etruria, a work gang begins their morning ritual. There's Gaius, who claims he once saw Caesar blink. There's Marcus, who insists sand is merely nature's confetti. And then there's old Severus, who's measured every milestone with his toe for reasons no one entirely understands. Their task today is to repair a sunken stretch of road where the paving stones have shifted, thanks to months of ox carts loaded with amphorae filled with wine, fish sauce, and, after too much wine, probably each other. The Roman road was an elegant layering of functionality. First, you dig a fossa, a trench to drain water and attract curious frogs. Then came the statumen, large stones that confidently declared, "We are the foundation." Above that, the ruderatio, crushed stones, smaller and smugger. Next, the nucleus, a fine layer of gravel and sand. And finally, the summum dorsum, the paving stones. These heavy polygonal marvels were placed with such precision that even Pliny the Elder might nod his beard in approval. Today, the crew wrestles with replacing a lifted paving stone. It's a lopsided monster that seems personally offended at being disturbed from its centuries-long nap. 4 men strain. Severus supervises with crossed arms and a skeptical eyebrow that could criticize marble. Somewhere in the distance, a mule expresses its disapproval in song. "Lift with the knees," Marcus mutters, moments before audibly forgetting to do so. Eventually, with sweat, teamwork, and the lamentations of a nearby lyre player trying to sell his mixtape, the block is repositioned. The road is somewhat smoother than it was that morning. Not perfect, for Roman law had no clause demanding perfection, but it would do. And once in place, the road receives its ritual blessing. Severus pats the stone twice, says something about Fortuna, and everyone pretends not to care, which, in Roman terms, means they care a great deal. Meanwhile, along busier thoroughfares near Rome, wealthier cities took maintenance into their own togas, funding repairs themselves out of local pride or competitive spite. Nothing says civic virtue like pointing out that your stretch of the Flaminian Way doesn't smell like expired garum. In some cases, emperors too took part in the propaganda of roadworks. Coins minted during the reigns of emperors like Trajan celebrated new bridges and highways, gently reminding citizens that while eternal glory may fade, well-funded infrastructure is forever. Administrative records from the tabularium, Rome's great paper hoarding institution, show reminders of state funds allocated for works overseen by the Senate, or more often, by someone sidestepping Senate approval with an eyebrow raise and a conveniently timed invasion elsewhere. As the sun drifts lower behind the cypress trees, our road workers pack away their tools. There's still more to be done, of course. Roads are fickle creatures, weathered by storms, worn by sandals, haunted occasionally by the argumentative ghosts of bureaucrats. But tomorrow is another day, and Rome, that great bundle of myth and marble, will still need someone willing to nudge a rock back into place. And speaking of edges worn smooth, we'll soon wander into the curious inspections and road audits that made even the most powerful quiver at the thought of a misplaced milestone. Somewhere between the satisfying crunch of gravel under a hobnailed sandal and the quiet hum of ox-drawn carts meandering through misty hills, we arrive at one of the lesser-sung melodies of Roman might, the utterly riveting, occasionally muddy work of Roman road inspections. Yes, dear dreamer, Roman engineers didn't build their roads and then pop off to sip watered wine on the Amalfi coast for eternity. No, they did checkups. Periodic, thorough, sometimes bureaucratically exhausting checkups. Allow your mind to drift, just for a moment, to the image of a toga-clad official, boots suitably grubby, squinting down an infinite ribbon of stone. muttering in Latin about potholes. That, dear listener, is a day in the life of a curator virum, the dignified-sounding but deeply practical Roman official responsible for road upkeep. Not quite the glamorous marble polisher of postcard Rome, but an unsung hero whose desk was piled, literally, with rocks. The Roman Senate, in all its olive oil-scented wisdom, had long ago realized that roads needed maintenance. They didn't just magically stay smooth and majestic. Weather eroded them, tree roots mischievously crept through the cracks, and let's not forget the never-ending commute of Roman armies, who weren't exactly known for tiptoeing. Roman roads were premium infrastructure. They were the veins of empire. If they failed, the mighty legions might trip before they could conquer someone. And so, a system was born. Beginning in the Republic and thriving well into the Empire, state-appointed inspectors were dispatched to monitor the roads. These men had the humdrum glamour of modern building inspectors, but carried the air of someone who might order a platoon to fill a pothole immediately. They stepped carefully along the paving stones, checking for subsidence, inspecting roadside drains, and occasionally issuing surprisingly stern fines to anyone who dared to let a tree lean too lovingly near the route. But not every road had its own curator viarum. That would have been wildly impractical, though very flattering to roads. Instead, key routes were prioritized. Like the Via Appia, often called the Queen of Roads, which absolutely refused to suffer low standards. Inspectors gave this route the full spa treatment, clearing out debris, relaying disturbed stones, and yes, even sweeping. Picture, if you will, a squad of workers sweeping a cobbled highway under the scrutinizing gaze of a Roman official who is deeply offended by a stray leaf. Funding for this oh-so-serious upkeep came from a melange of sources. Sometimes towns were charged. Wealthy landowners were occasionally invited, read, firmly told, to contribute, especially if a stretch of road ran across their estate. And then, of course, there were the emperors, eager to impress not only the gods, but the citizen masses as well. They would often throw their personal wealth, or at least the treasuries, behind refurbishing beloved roads. Imagine the imperial PR. Augustus resurfaces via Flaminia, citizens rejoice. Now, maintenance in Rome wasn't exclusively about repairs. It involved mapping, benchmarks, and delightful acts of record-keeping. Statues were sometimes erected to commemorate road restorations, because Roman pride ran hot even when discussing drainage improvements. There were also milestones, literally, stones placed every 1,000 paces, not just to mark distance, but to credit the emperor or governor responsible for that particular patch of maintenance. A sort of ancient shout-out. This smoothness brought to you by Marcus Fabius Superbus. You're welcome. And dear listener, how could we forget the travelling public in all this? Merchants, soldiers, couriers, the occasional philosopher with sandals full of existential questions. They appreciated a well-maintained road, not just because it spared them bone-jarring jolts, but because certain rest areas and road stations, mansiones and mutationes, tended to thrive when the roads were good. Food stayed warmer, latrines were less alarming, and messages moved swiftly across the empire, trailing echoes of whispers from Britain to Byzantium. Of course, perfect maintenance wasn't always guaranteed. Rain stubbornly fell. Carts overloaded with amphorae sometimes caused dents that even veteran roadmen sighed at. But even in disrepair, Roman roads maintained their dignity, their ancient geometry untouched by the menace of haphazard country lanes. So next time you doze off in the backseat of a car, humming along a silky highway, think back, lightly, dreamily, to those watchful Roman eyes, peering down the stone veins of empire, measuring, inspecting, preserving a legacy that refused to fall apart at the seams. Rome didn't just build to last. Rome checked up on it weekly. And somewhere ahead, under the soft, salt-scented stars, we'll make our way toward another story about those tireless ancient tinkerers, their tools, and their dreams of roads that stretched forever. Rest easy, and let the next stones settle softly into place. When it came to road maintenance in ancient Rome, one might expect heroic tales of civic engineers flexing their geometric muscle with aqueducts and archways. But the truth, so wonderfully and soporifically dull, is that much of Rome's road upkeep came down to something far less glamorous: potholes. Yes, potholes. Even the mighty Roman Empire, at the height of its logistical genius, wasn't immune to the cruel tyranny of water erosion and wheel damage. If you squint very gently and imagine yourself reclining on a triclinium under the stars, you might even envision a toga-clad municipal official sighing deeply at the sight of earth giving way beneath basalt. One of the lesser-known careers available to ambitious Roman citizens was that of the curator viarum, a dignified title for someone whose primary task was keeping the roads from becoming open invitations to wheel-snapping disasters. These brave bureaucrats accepted their fate with stoic resignation, supervising crews of workers who patched, swept, and occasionally entirely relaid road surfaces up and down the empire. Contrary to romanticized images of blood and glory combat and marble columns, most of Roman life was built upon the quiet hum of maintenance. And Roman roads, those ruler-straight ribbons of empire, were nothing if not needy. You see, the famed roadways, in their earliest phases, were engineered with astounding, if slightly obsessive, attention to layering. There were as many as 5 different strata in some sections, ranging from massive stones at the bottom to tight, smooth paving slabs at the top. It worked. It really did, for a while. But then came time. Rain, hooves, carts, people, more rain. And before you could say, Av Potolium, some poor mule's foot would get stuck, and Rome's rolling commerce ground to a squeaky halt. The practical solution for these mortal wounds in the empire's arteries: sand and gravel for minor injuries, cobbles and mortar for deep wounds, and when things got particularly dire, full resurfacing, which involved dismantling the top layers and reconstructing them from scratch. An ancient version of a city-wide road closure, minus the neon vests and coffee breaks. There were laws too. Oh yes, Rome didn't just rely on goodwill and shovels. Inscriptions show that emperors often delegated maintenance responsibilities to wealthy senators or municipal councils. It was considered both a duty and a prestigious chore. Nothing says senatorial gravitas quite like personally managing a 2-mile stretch of Via Flaminia. To help cover costs, Rome introduced tolls, not with popping toll gates or beepable cards, but sometimes with milestones announcing fines for those caught damaging the roads. Imagine that. You're trundling along in your ox cart when you spot a large stone post that reads, "In deadpan Latin, if thou diggeth a ditch upon this road, may the gods fine thee 40 drachmas and a swift demotion in your amphora club." Of course, being Rome, road maintenance wasn't just a local concern. The military had standards. If legions were going to march across provinces with that famous rhythmic thud, the roads needed to be policed regularly. Which brings us to a charming bit of trivia. There were, in some cases, designated road inspectors, mensa viarum, wandering the countryside on foot or mule, armed with measuring staffs and an apparent thirst for order. Essentially, the Roman equivalent of a transit authority, just with more bronze and fewer complaint forms. And for the elite, there were high expectations. If a formerly well-maintained road degraded near your villa, your neighbors might whisper. It reflected poorly on your sense of responsibility and possibly your moss control practices. So yes, the ancient world had HOA drama too. Still, as dusk falls over the silent stones of the Via Appia and the moss climbs slowly in the cracks that once saw the marching feet of generations, there's something almost tender about it. Civilization, for all its grandeur, depends on the humble effort of patching things before they fall apart. Cobble by cobble, bucket by bucket, the empire held itself together. And as night settles over those long forgotten lanes, listen closely. You might just hear the echo of footsteps, not of emperors or orators, but anonymous workers with chisels and gravel sacks, keeping the world quietly intact. Now, as we wander gently along that moonlit path, perhaps it's time to look at how Romans measured these endlessly straight highways, with devices oddly reminiscent of very ancient Fitbits. Not all Roman heroes wore sandals or bore gladius swords into smoky battlefields. Some of them wore tunics slightly stained with tar, smelled faintly of crushed limestone, and wielded a pickaxe with more charisma than the average senator. These were the maintainers, the quiet champions of the empire's under-acknowledged but always underfoot infrastructure. The Roman roads. Now, contrary to what some dramatized scrolls might suggest, Roman roads didn't eternally glisten on their own. Left unattended, even the proudest stone causeway would quickly devolve into a gravelly riddle of potholes and goat prints. The empire, having realized the charm of legible logistics, invested quite a bit in making sure their highways didn't age like a neglected amphora of fish sauce. And this brings us, with all the subtlety of a donkey cart, to the officinae, charming little road repair gangs scattered along major routes. These crews were the empire's version of mobile pit stops, minus the espresso machines, but with plenty of gravel and stern enthusiasm. Their job? To ensure that Roman roads remained smoother than a toga salesman's compliments. Each officina was responsible for a stretch of road, and, rather helpfully, they had standard tools, a kind of Roman Home Depot on the go. Rammers, chisels, buckets made of leather, and the ever-handy dolabra, half pickaxe, half mattock, all magnificent. These were the multi-tools of the maintenance world. Had Swiss army knives existed, the dolabra likely would have sued for copyright infringement. Now, let's not pretend they had Google Calendars or an app that pinged them whenever a stepping stone was feeling emotionally unstable. No. Inspections were handled with a mix of routine and grumbling. Senators or other semi-important road surveyors, often portly gentlemen with soft sandals and strong opinions, would amble down sections of road, observing wear and tear like connoisseurs of crushed granite. Their conclusions were carefully scribbled onto wax tablets while standing precariously near livestock. These reports were then sent along to the curatores viarum, Roman road overseers. The title curator today might conjure museum glass and hushed tones, but in ancient Rome, it meant a kind of bureaucratic superhero, responsible for everything from budgeting repairs to ensuring that repair crews didn't spend their days betting on chariot races and trimming topiary animals into sarcastic shapes. Funding, naturally, was a process infused with all the tedium of statecraft. Maintenance didn't come cheap, and although emperors liked to boast about how you could march from Gaul to Judea without dirt in your sandals, getting denarii to pay for crushed limestone wasn't exactly thrilling public policy. Sometimes, towns along the road shared costs, and sometimes wealthy citizens donated to road repairs in a civic display of generosity and dramatically inscribed their names in stone plaques that definitely weren't subtle. But the most charming bit may be this. Roads had birth certificates, not quite scrolls tied with ribbon, but official inscriptions at the start of road segments recording when, why, and how the road was built or repaired. For example, a marker on the Appian Way might read something like, "In the 9th year of the Emperor Hadrian, under the auspices of Marcus Flavius Magniloquentus, this section was thoroughly corrected after heavy rainfall and goat-induced erosion." Charming, and as always, gently dramatic. With an empire that sprawled moodily across 3 continents, maintaining synchronized travel was a logistical ballet. And small wonder, legions had to march, wine had to be transported, and gossip had to travel faster than a whisper through a marbled atrium. Over time, maintenance became a kind of quiet rhythm, like the soft sigh of sandals on cooled flint, or the rhythmic thunk of a Dolabra meeting ground. It might not have been glamorous, but it kept the empire connected, one pebble at a time. And if all this seems quaint, imagine a maintenance crew pausing for lunch under a fig tree, dusting stonemasonry from their bread and speculating on whether Augustus's aquiline nose was inherited or a result of artistic flattery. As twilight gathered over the olive trees and the sound of distant hooves faded into balsamic dusk, one could almost feel the weight of the road beneath you, old, enduring, and just recently patched by a man named Gaius, with suspiciously fancy sandals for a labourer. Next, in the hush of the evening, we'll drift toward mile markers and the secret messages hidden in their unblinking stone faces. Somewhere between the imperial grandeur of marble forums and the muddy sandals of ordinary Roman life lay the unsung hero of the empire's infrastructure, the cursus publicus. Ah yes, the Roman state-run postal and transportation system. Less about heartfelt letters home, and more about efficiently moving military directives and tax receipts at unsettling speeds. Picture it now. A dreamy scroll of papyrus hurtling across the countryside faster than Lucius after dropping a tray in the Senate's canteen. At the core of the cursus publicus was not romance or poetry, but spreadsheets with far more sandals and considerably fewer pivot tables. And perhaps the unsung MVPs of this whole operation were the way stations. The Romans called them mutationes and mansiones, the Airbnb and Hertz of the Roman road network, if you will. Mutationes were simple rest stops to trade out tired horses, buffet not included, and mansions offered full accommodations with stabling, beds, and occasionally stew of questionable origin. Now imagine you're a mid-level Roman bureaucrat, let's say Gaius from accounts receivable, zipping down the Via Appia on urgent imperial business. Against a dramatic moonlit sky, like some toga-clad action hero minus the explosions, you arrive at a mutatio. There's no time to waste. Your steed is swapped faster than a toga at laundry, and off you go into the darkness. No GPS, no snacks, and tragically, no podcasts. Just you, your message, and perhaps a camel looking judgmental in the corner. This would all be a logistical nightmare if not for the Roman obsession with measurement. The empire was utterly romantically entwined with the art of distance. Roads were carefully plotted, often marked by stone obelisks known as miliaria. These mile markers didn't just tell you the distance to Rome, because let's face it, that's always where you're headed in a Roman story, but also occasionally bore the names of emperors, a lovely gesture like having your name engraved on every third light pole. This mile lovingly brought to you by Emperor Hadrian, wishing you smooth travels and an absence of Gauls. The placement of these stations followed a particular rhythm, a darkly poetic one. A mutario every 8 to 12 Roman miles, a mansio every 20 to 30. This way, no imperial courier had an excuse to slack off unless it was due to wild boars, rebellious locals, or the existential dread of being part of Roman bureaucracy. But who maintained all this? Infrastructure? Naturally, it fell to the provinces, because nothing says great imperial system like passing responsibility downstream. Governors were expected to keep the station stocked, horses fed, and roofs intact, all while being absolutely certain not to flatter themselves into thinking they mattered. After all, their names rarely went on the mile markers. The messengers themselves were emissaries of sleepless haste, known as cursories. Wonders of stamina and short attention spans, they would dart from station to station, bearing scrolls sealed with wax and imperial smugness. And woe betide any innkeeper or station master who couldn't supply a fresh horse fast enough. The emperor didn't take kindly to delays, especially when his dinner wine delivery depended on it. And then there was the vehicular, state-issued transportation vehicles, pulled by oxen or horses, depending on the urgency. These included the humble raider, a roomy cart with 4 wheels and a certain rustic charm. While definitely not a chariot of fire, it did have its finer points, such as a tendency for the wheels to make a rhythmic clatter that doubled as a lullaby for road-weary passengers. The quality of service did, of course, vary wildly. In some provinces, you might enjoy a hearty supper and a sturdy bed. In others, a suspicious wooden cot and a host who resembled someone who definitely moonlighted as a bandit. But it didn't matter. Business moved, commands travelled, provinces were supervised, and taxes hauled. All thanks to a system that involved more horseshoes than your average fortune teller's wall. The cursus publicus wasn't just logistics, it was the circulatory system of empire. The roads were the arteries, the messages, the blood, and the horses. Well, mostly tired. But it was this unromantic machinery that allowed Rome to pretend it could be everywhere at once, controlling, commanding, collecting, and occasionally correcting typos in Senate decrees delivered 3 weeks too late. And as the moon arches high over the rutted stones of some far-off provincial road, a weary bureaucrat leans back in a squeaky raider. His scroll delivered, his conscience lightened, his tunic loosened just so. There's murmuring from the accompanying horse, who suspects oats were promised and not delivered. But that, dear listener, is a matter for another stretch of highway, just beyond the next mile marker. By moonlight or midday sun, a Roman road was never truly alone. Beneath the feet of travellers and the wheels of carts, it lived a rather dramatic life. Dusty, creaky, and segmented like a well-disciplined millipede, each stretch of road bore the legacy and the literal footprints of senators, slaves, merchants, goats, and ambitious plumbers who hadn't yet discovered indoor piping. But by the 9th decade of any given century, the roads needed a little attention. Enter the unsung heroes of maintenance, Rome's road inspectors, or curatores viarum. These were not action-packed gladiators or toga-flapping politicians. No, these were the clipboard-carrying civil servants of the empire, the kind of people who could spot a pothole at 50 paces and draft 3 distinct proposals to fill it. The curatores viarum weren't alone in their noble cause. They often partnered with the local municipalities, who provided labour in the form of convicts, soldiers with minor disciplinary infractions, or, if someone was terribly unlucky that week, the town's own citizens under forced labor quotas. Picture a toga-wrapped baker silently weeping as he spreads gravel with a trowel, wondering why he hadn't bribed a magistrate last month. With imperial taxes, temple offerings, loot from rebellions, and every kind of coin rattling through the coffers, Rome had a variety of ways to fund road maintenance. But consistency? Not so much. 1 century, a bustling trade route would be given a lavish resurfacing, complete with limestone curbing and fancy milestone carvings. The next, it might be left to the tender mercies of moss and goat traffic until it resembled more of a suggestion than a road. Let us drift now to a sleepy Roman outpost in Gaul, a quaint little town ambitiously named Nova Roma Secundus, despite being neither new, Roman, nor really a town. There, a group of 6 maintenance workers, known respectfully as the stationari, were tasked with keeping the main road clear of debris, bandits, and occasional post-party chariot wreckage. These men were not fearsome warriors. More often, they were retirees or half-trained militia, with dull spears and even duller senses of direction. In one particularly illuminating scroll, written by a clearly disgruntled official with a flair for sarcasm, the stationari were documented spending an entire week trying to relocate a missing milestone that had actually been toppled by a drunken ox and was resting peacefully in a nearby stream. They eventually reinstalled it upside down, proclaiming it an aesthetic statement. In densely populated areas, road maintenance took on a more communal spirit. Neighbors would gather for seemingly spontaneous cleaning festivals, where the wealthy volunteers brought out their slaves, and the poorer ones mostly brought gossip and sandals in varying states of repair. The most common repair technique, shoveling gravel until the hole no longer made unpleasant noises when stepped in. And yet, for all their scattered efforts, Rome's road repair tools were surprisingly refined. They used a layered pavement system called VAE, with a foundation of crushed stones called statumen, topped by a layer of finer stones, then sand, and finally flattish, smooth paving slabs. It was a process so thorough, modern engineers still nervously glance at Roman roads with a mixture of admiration and mild professional insecurity. Pity the poor itinerant surveyor, though, known as a grammaticus, who had to trudge the length of these roads with a groma, an awkward T-shaped instrument used for aligning straight lines. Nothing says meticulous like a man in sandals arguing with a tree about geometry on the Appian Way. By twilight, the roads buzzed gently with echoes of the past, sandal thuds, whispered curses from labourers, the swoosh of a senator's cloak as he bemoaned the lack of marble at a rest stop. Maintenance, after all, was a kind of civic meditation. Not heroic, not glamorous, but necessary. A gentle rhythm of order keeping the chaos of empire moving forward. Now, as we pass the milepost at the edge of another memory, the road fades softly into evening mist. Ahead lies more than dirt and stone. Something humbler, yet quietly grand. Something awaiting a good sweep, and perhaps a slightly straighter groma. Let's walk a little farther into the dusky lanes of antiquity. In the hushed glow of an early Roman morning, when the mist rolled off the fields like a toga slipping from a half-awake senator, teams of humble workers were already at their posts along the empire's vast and crisscrossing network of roads. Among them were the curatores viarum and their loyal army of stone whisperers and ditch diggers, those quietly heroic individuals responsible for making sure that one didn't sprain an ankle en route to conquering Gaul or picking up olives. Now you may wonder, how did the Romans organize their road repair efforts across a 250,000-mile network of paved perfection? Well, as with many things Roman, it involved a lot of scrolls, a moderate amount of shouting in Latin, and just a pinch of divine intervention, or at least a few stern prayers to Saturn and some crossed fingers under togas. Enter the curatores viarum, magistrates tasked with overseeing specific stretches of the road. These men were the regional managers of transport infrastructure, except instead of passive-aggressively emailing about potholes, they dispatched crews of slaves, soldiers, and liberti to patch them with military efficiency and mathematical precision. Each curator reported up the chain to the Senate, who, naturally, preferred not to get dust in their sandals if they could help it. Beneath the curators, the actual repair work fell to contractors and labourers cleverly nicknamed redemptores. These were not in fact ancient redeemers sent to ease your commute, but contractors who specialised in fixing bits and bobs of the Via Appia and her lesser-known road cousins. They submitted their bids, argued about budgets, and were occasionally punished for shoddy work by being made to walk barefoot down their own handiwork. Quality assurance, Roman style. Now, maintenance was not just a response to wear and tear. Roman roads were proactively inspected, especially after bad weather, troop movements, or incidents involving escaped circus animals. Don't laugh. It's recorded that a runaway elephant once cracked a side road near Capua. In colder provinces like Britannia and Germania, freezing and thawing posed serious structural risks. To address such challenges, the Romans engineered roads with carefully layered foundations. Large stones at the base for stability, rubble for drainage, gravel for shape, and smooth paving stones on top for elegance and the occasional dramatic stumble. What's even more impressive is the surveyors, known as grammatici, who used their charmingly fussy tools, such as the gromma and corrubates, to ensure roads were level, aligned, and just interesting enough to keep bandits guessing. These surveyors were like the ancient world's obsessive uncles, always checking if the floor is truly flat and insisting it's off by half a degree. But thanks to their diligence, some Roman roads were so straight, they made timelines jealous. And then there was the money. Road upkeep wasn't cheap, even when your labour force was mostly unpaid and occasionally revolting. Funds came from the public treasury, wealthy patrons, and religious institutions keen on keeping pilgrims from tripping on their way to venerate sacred goats. In many cases, milestones, those bulky stone GPS markers, were inscribed with the names of whoever funded the repairs, turning the Roman highway system into something of a civic donor wall. This stretch of the Via Flaminia, generously restored by Gaius, had little else to do. But make no mistake, even with all this effort, Roman road maintenance was often a chaotic ballet of bronze talent and muddy boots. Repairs were announced with wooden placards, hastily hammered into the ground, and then ignored by charioteers in a rush. Detours led through suspicious fields filled with statues that might have been watching you. And complaints? Well, if you had a problem with the road, you filed a formal complaint in triplicate, scratched onto wax tablets and left in the nearest forum, where, several months later, a sleepy scribe might read your grievance aloud and comment, another complaint about slippery feathers near the poultry market. Still, for all the bureaucracy, the sandal blisters, and the occasional goat-related delays, the Roman maintenance system worked shockingly well. These roads endured for millennia. In fact, some of them are still underfoot today, quietly supporting modern traffic, while wondering when someone will finally patch that fissure from 267 AD. And so, as the stars hang low over the Pyrenees and mules trudge silently by moonlight, somewhere a lone road worker, likely named Marcus or possibly Justus, runs his hands over ancient stones, checking joints with a mason's caress. His torch flickers, his breath fogs in the cool night, and he nods in approval. Tomorrow, another mile to check, another cut stone to place, steady, eternal, and overlooked. Let us wander next to the mystery of roadside rest stops, because even ancient commuters needed a break for cheese, wine, and existential dread, as Roman roads snaked across the empire like an overachieving spiderweb, winding through provinces with names that feel like lost spells. Illyricum, Mauritania, Britannia. They didn't simply lay there in stoic silence. No, these stone arteries required regular, devoted care. Much like your houseplants when you remember you own them, Roman roads needed both attention and a touch of guilt. By now, the allure of carving gorgeous straight lines through swamps, forests, and the occasional surprise village had given way to the duller, though no less noble reality of upkeep. And overseeing such maintenance was none other than the curator virum, a title that sounds like a fancy bottle of perfume but translates to something dreadfully practical: keeper of the roads. The curator virum was typically a Roman senator, appointed not because he had strong opinions about gravel, but because prestige in Rome was a little like glitter. It got everywhere, especially where it wasn't strictly necessary. Imagine a man bred for politics and poetry, now standing in sandals, squinting unimpressed at a pothole just outside Capua. His job involved ensuring roads remained passable, which in Rome's case meant flat enough to march an army over without spraining an ankle. To help with this, the curator employed a small army of road workers, statio men, contractors, and at times prisoners or enslaved people. Their tools were picks, hammers, carts, and an unshakable belief that the earth was always going to try and ruin a good road. But the true champions of maintenance were the humble milestone markers. These weren't just quaint Instagrammable remnants. No, these were state-sponsored bragging poles, placed every Roman mile, about 1,000 paces, telling you how far you were from Rome, who paid for the road, and sometimes who resealed it. Picture it. You're trudging along the Via Appia, the sun sizzling like fried eggs overhead, and there it is, milestone CLI. Emperor Hadrian's name etched deep into the stone, like an imperial graffiti artist bothering future hikers. Yep, Hadrian paved this part, probably while thinking about his wall. Some of these stones even bore Latin inscriptions noting updates or repairs made by later emperors. It's kind of like a bathroom wall at a dive bar, but classier and with more entablature. A truck's bumper sticker might say, "My other car is a chariot," but a Roman milestone might read, "This road was repaired under Emperor Septimius Severus on a Tuesday during locust season." Practical and poetic. Then there's the money. Roman road maintenance didn't come cheap. Funds came from imperial coffers, provincial taxes, and occasionally from very rich men hoping to curry favor. Wealthy citizens angling for a statue in the Forum, or maybe just guilt from driving their carts like maniacs, sometimes paid to restore stretches of road or build little rest stops called mansiones. These weren't five-star resorts, but they did have roofs, basic meals, and if you were lucky, a guy who didn't snore in the next room. Some of the more industrious emperors like Augustus actually made road maintenance a signature brag. In his autobiography, the Res Gestae, he lists all the roads he'd repaired as though he were ticking off items on a well-funded honey-do list. Fix this one, refurbished that bridge, improved drainage near Pompeii, really knocked it out of the forums this year. And drainage, by the way, was crucial. Roman engineers, being less than enchanted with muddy catastrophes, built roads with a crown centre and sloped sides. Water rolled off like insults off a togaed politician. Ditches and culverts were common roadside companions, discreetly taking water far enough away so it couldn't mischievously turn cobbles into a slip and slide. Still, things didn't always go to plan. Earthquakes, floods, and over-enthusiastic barbarian raids often meant repairs weren't so much proactive as frantic. Cue a sad group of workers shoveling gravel back into place while muttering about how Attila really had no respect for precast concrete. And then there were tolls. Yes, even the Romans couldn't resist. At certain stretches, especially at bridges, travellers could be asked to pay a modest fee, typically a vectigalia or portorium. Coins were dropped into weary hands, who either kept track with wax tablets or, one might imagine, mentally pledged to spend it all on olives and sandals. Maintaining a Roman road was a constant battle between stone and entropy. But through columns of dust and the tramp of hobnailed sandals, the roads remained, a testament to stubbornness, ingenuity, and the enduring Roman refusal to walk in mud. Let's now follow the gravel trail a little further, toward the lives of those who walked the roads, for business, for glory, or simply because they missed the last horse out of town, somewhere just outside the bustling boundaries of Roman Londinium, that foggy outpost that would one day host double-decker chariots and fish and chips. We find a peculiar man named Flavius Septimulus, standing knee-deep in gravel, holding a spade in one hand and a complaint tablet in the other. Flavius, officially titled Curator Virium, or Guy in Charge of Roads, who everyone blames when their cart gets stuck, found solace in the crunch of fresh stones and the smell of bitumen in the morning. He also found a great deal of stress and a troubling number of splinters, but such was the price of empire. You see, road maintenance in the Roman world didn't just involve patching potholes and shooing goats off the shoulder. No. It was a veritable opera of engineering, funding, legal scrolls, and, more often than not, passive-aggressive tablets written by disgruntled citizens. Flavius had received one just this morning that read, "If I wanted to break an axle, I'd travel to Gaul." Kind words, really, by Roman standards. Now, Roman roads were the veins through which the empire pulsed, smooth arteries of stone and sweat that brought troops, traders, tax collectors, and the occasional philosopher who got lost while pondering the meaning of via. But like any mighty infrastructure project, they weren't built to last without care. The fabled straightness of these roads wasn't just for ease of travel. It was also an engineering choice that made maintenance slightly less of a nightmare. Slightly. Flavius oversaw one of the wealthier segments of the road network, fortunate enough to be marked as Via Publica, a public road maintained at state expense. That meant Rome itself paid for the repairs, though paid might be optimistic. Funds came sporadically and often attached to a wax-sealed list of strong suggestions, mostly beginning with "make it last this time." He employed work gangs of skilled labourers called statio viaria, who carried various impressive titles but mostly just carried heavy rocks. They wore tunics stiff with lime dust and used ancient tools with names like dolabra and sarculum, which sound like spells at a Hogwarts construction site. Their task? To ensure the road's layers remain pristine. Deep foundations of stone, a layer of crushed gravel, then small, tightly fitted polygonal surface stones, and crucially, the crown, the gentle humped shape in the middle that helped water run off like worried senators fleeing a debate. Of course, water was the road's mortal enemy. Rain, snowmelt, the occasional aqueduct leak. It all conspired to seep into the cracks and frost heave the thoroughfares into geological accordion music, which is why part of Flavius's job involved maintaining ditches and roadside drains and keeping them cheerfully clear of debris, tree roots, and the occasional very lost tortoise. One difficult truth plagued Flavius nightly. Despite all efforts, the wear and tear of oxen hooves, iron-rimmed carts and sandals with suspiciously lightweight tourists never truly ceased. And although the roads were miraculous in design, the materials had limits. Pumice stones didn't grow stronger with age, to his disappointment. To make matters more theatrical, the roads also functioned as open-air shrines to imperial glory. Milestones, milia passuum, placed every 1,000 paces, told not just distances, but of emperors past, who built what, when, and often just how terribly magnificent they were while doing so. Woe betide the road official whose milestone toppled into the ditch. One such mishap led to a full audit by imperial officials, 3 record scrolls, and an unfortunate demotion to a swampy stretch outside Brundisium. Nevertheless, there were bright days, those occasions when a section had just been resurfaced, laid so precisely that even centurions would whisper compliments under their breath. There were little pebbly victories, a stubborn weed vanquished, a culvert cleared, a traveller remarking, "This road is so smooth, I barely spilled my wine." High praise indeed. And so, as twilight spread its lazy purple scarf across Britannia's damp skies, Flavius surveyed his stretch of Roman real estate. Another day, another cartload of stone, another 4 sarcastic tablets. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his back, and whispered to no one in particular, "At least they're straight." In the distance, a new complaint arrived, attached to a donkey that appeared to have walked the entire journey backward. But first, Flavius had to meet with a group of local contractors who insisted that their cousin's cousin was a drainage expert. Ah yes, nothing said public works, quite like family connections, ancient procurement policies, and 3 barrels of surprisingly subpar mortar. It was time to descend, gently of course, into the world of Roman maintenance contracts and the delightful bureaucracy that catalogued them. The forms, dear listener. Oh, the forms. Somewhere between the olive groves of Latium and the foothills of the Apennines, where wild goats loitered and poets aspired to be taken seriously, the wheels of Roman bureaucracy groaned with a silent but determined purpose. Road inspections. Yes, dear listener, the roads of Rome were not simply left to crack and crumble like a week-old loaf of spelt bread. No. They were diligently watched over by one of Rome's most compelling and underappreciated administrative entities, the curatores viarum, or as we might more whimsically call them, the custodians of cobblestone destiny. These were no sweaty labourers, mind you. Oh no, the curatores were of the senatorial class, the kind of toga-wearing, sandal-pinning folk who wouldn't be caught dead lifting a paving stone. Their job was to supervise maintenance, a word which here carries less the tone of backaches and more the ambience of pontificating under the shade of a fig tree while scribes took notes. It was their task to keep roads in shape, report their condition, and allocate funding, which meant budgeting for gravel, calculating bridge repair costs, and possibly tracking down the odd runaway ox cart of tar pitch. But what, you whisper between yawns, if the road itself had a pothole the size of a praetorian's footbath? Who mended it? Ah, That honour fell to the menders of Rome's arteries, a motley crew of craftsmen and labourers known as the statio, a word that in this context means local maintenance squad, and not, as in other cases, military outpost, or a place to buy boiled wine with questionable ethics. These stadio were stationed all along the great Roman roads, particularly near bustling junctions where oxen traffic rivaled modern downtown rotundium during Saturnalia's final hours. Now, let us pause here to gently unfurl a picture in the tapestry of our imagination. Sunrise over the Via Aemilia, a low mist rolling through the countryside like a sleepy toga. The statio, leader, whose name might have been Pius or perhaps Cato, always popular choices, sips watered wine and inspects a pothole the way a philosopher inspects the fate of the empire, with squinted eyes and minimal enthusiasm. Around him, workmen gather, one fetching stone dust, another hauling a basket of lime, and yet another entirely unsure why he's here, but happy to take a lunch break anyway. They worked with materials as ancient as ambition itself: crushed stone, volcanic ash, and layers upon layers of compacted earth, as if Mother Nature herself were in on the engineering. The technique was called viae munitae, the fortified roads, and indeed, they were built as though local traffic included occasional charges by war elephants, which, to the Romans, was a genuine concern. Road inspections weren't just about potholes and cracked paving stones. No, Roman roads served military, economic, and social purposes. They delivered legions, grain, scrolls, gossip, and the occasional poorly made statue across thousands of miles, which meant roads had to be more than technically functional. They had to be symbolically immaculate, much like dinner parties at Cicero's. And for the especially prestigious roads, like the Via Appia, the Queen of Roads herself, maintenance became something of a civic performance. Annual inspections by travelling officials were held with the gravity of a senatorial debate, and, I suspect, the thrill of discovering whether that one suspiciously moist patch had finally caved in. Important citizens competed to sponsor repairs, carving their names into the newly laid stones. Yes, long before modern mayors plastered their faces on bus stops, Romans immortalized their generosity by stamping restored by Marcus Flavius Aquinius with his own denarii. Directly into the path trudged daily by donkeys and disgruntled tax collectors. It wasn't a perfect system. There were times, of course, when a rainy season turned a road segment into a kind of off-brand spa for livestock, or when funding diverted mysteriously into the pockets of a governor with flashy taste in marble sinks. But by and large, the rhythms of maintenance pulse steadily through provinces and seasons, bridging conquered lands and distant hearts. Roads, in a way, were Rome's slow heartbeat, and those who inspected and mended them for coin, for glory, for obligation, or simply because their cousin got them the job, were vital to keeping the empire stitched together with stone, sweat, and sublime bureaucratic paperwork. Let your thoughts meander now, like a weary mule along the Via Flaminia, nodding gently with each step, each stone lovingly examined by the weary eyes of Roman inspectors. Our journey continues along the margins of this ancient infrastructure, where curious things sometimes linger. Somewhere along the Via Appia, under a pearl-grey afternoon sky, a weary Roman road inspector named Publius Flavius Tarsus bent down to examine what he believed to be the early stages of a rut. Not just any rut, of course. No, this was a Class II grooved surface deformation, as outlined in Imperial Road Maintenance Edict the 23rd, Clause 6. And for Publius, who took great pride in his copy of the edict, which he had personally copied onto a tablet despite not technically being required to. The matter was grave. With the solemn flair of an oracle examining sacred entrails, he ran 2 calloused fingers along the depression in the stone. One could almost hear the whisper of cartwheels long gone, their iron rings biting ever so slightly deeper each season. He gave a thoughtful grunt and muttered, "Could be a transtiberine axle, too narrow for a Sardinian load beast." Behind him loomed a cart pulled by 2 disgruntled mules and an even more disgruntled merchant transporting amphorae of fermented fish sauce. The mules matched the merchant in attitude, refusing to proceed as long as Publius occupied the suspicious area of potential fracture. So there the group paused, caught in a standoff of solemn civic duty versus increasingly aromatic cargo. You see, while Roman roads may sparkle in the imagination today, bearing noble standards and noble sandals alike, in reality, they were a bit like Roman togas, crisp and refined when fresh, hilariously prone to stains, creases, and public indecency over time. The famed durability of Roman roads owed much not just to their layered stonework, but to the tireless grind of maintenance crews like Publius, who took potholes as personal insults. Maintenance of these roads wasn't a matter of idle repair. It was a vast bureaucratic ballet, quite possibly the only instance in Roman administration where speed limits were less about control and more about survival. For instance, the cursus publicus, Rome's official postal service, hurtled down highways at nearly 10 miles per hour when at full gallop. That doesn't sound impressive until you remember the roads were made of stone. The vehicles were essentially scaled-up wheelbarrows, and shock absorbers had yet to be invented. So it fell to men like Publius to stand vigilantly between civilization and chaos. With his wax tablet steadily filling with notes, Area 7, minor rut near milestone 134. Recommend gravel application 2 double handfuls deep. He ensured that Rome's imperial arteries didn't clot. He was what Roman poets might call a custos viae, a guardian of roads, though they typically didn't, being more interested in shepherds and nymphs. At times, repairs were funded by local municipalities, elite benefactors, or emperor-endorsed promising nephews. Occasionally, entire stretches could be rebuilt overnight if the emperor happened to be traveling that way and disliked bumps, even if said bumps were part of a historically significant battle of the ruts from 3 centuries prior. Emperors, like picky dinner guests, often required smooth entrances. In cases of longer-term wear, Roman engineers might perform something we'd now call resurfacing, though they referred to it with the alarming term restructio superiorem, which sounds suspiciously like a gladiatorial move, but actually meant dumping a lot more gravel on top and pounding it flat with a heavy roller. Said roller, of course, being pushed by men whose job titles translated roughly to official flattener of flattenings. Now, back to our dear Publius. By late afternoon, he had flagged 5 suspicious ruts, 1 suspicious merchant, and an extremely suspicious snail that he claimed had been loitering near a drainage channel for an unusually long time. He penned a note recommending further observation and possibly a very tiny helmet for the mollusk. The merchant had finally departed, his fish sauce sloshing ominously with every bump, while Publius watched the sun tilt gently toward the horizon. He unrolled the scroll containing his district's maintenance budget, highlighted in red ink, and squinted at the figures. He had tentatively requested funds for a stone polishing initiative, priority level, morale, and 2 new shovels, after Decimus tripped over the old ones and broke both handles, and his dignity. Evenings in roadwork life were quiet affairs. a bit of lentil mash, a small fire, and maybe, if the mood was right, a dramatic reenactment of great rut audits from years past. Publius would do all the voices, especially the senators, who always sounded like mildly offended ducks. As twilight wrapped the road in amethyst shadows, he pulled a woolen cloak over his shoulders and looked one last time at the stretch of road he'd so lovingly catalogued. The stones glittered faintly under the rising moon, worn but not broken. After all, the empire may rise and fall, emperors may come and go, some faster than a mule dragged over a slick of spilled wine, but the roads must always be smooth, or vaguely smooth, or at least not entirely upside down, which is often enough. And somewhere just east of the next milestone, a curious little mystery was waiting. An ancient graffiti marking carved into the road's surface, rumoured to be a prank by a bored centurion with a chisel and too much leftover wine. But that, as Publius knew, would have to be inspected tomorrow. In the dusky half-light of a Roman afternoon, somewhere between the 6th and 7th hour, depending on where exactly the sun sat over your shoulder, maintenance crews assembled like sleepy bees buzzing into formation around Terra's finest experiment in straight-line stubbornness, the Roman road. Now, don't let the term maintenance crew summon images of fluorescent vests and leaf blowers. In the Roman world, maintenance involved a delightful mixture of conscripted labourers, civic-minded citizens, and more often than you'd hope, deeply unimpressed military engineers muttering "Optimus Maximus preserve us all" under their breath. Roman roads, you see, were more than just bits of crushed rock and imperial ambition. They were treated with about the same reverence as a favourite emperor or a particularly good amphora of olive oil. And like those cherished amphorae, roads sometimes cracked and chipped and sagged and occasionally sprouted vegetation with the tenacity of an uninvited wedding guest. When that occurred, a magical little Roman mechanism clicked into place. And by magical, I do mean meticulously bureaucratic. Enter the censor. No, not the toga-clad fingerwagger in charge of the public morals, though yes, he was generally just as dry as he sounds. This censor had a spreadsheet in his soul and a city map carved into the folds of his very toga. He was responsible for inspecting roads and assigning required repairs, a title that perhaps sounds dull, until you remember these were men whose thrill of choice was measuring ditch depth and calculating camber slope angles. The censor would issue a contract known as an opus publicum, or public work, and this would be fulfilled by wealthy citizens eager to prove their virtue through the ancient Roman art of fixing potholes. It wasn't all pickaxes and sweat, though. Oh no. The Romans had standardized units for everything. Row widths, stone size, even the precise blend of volcanic ash and lime that made up their beloved concrete. Opus cementitium. Some might find the bureaucratic zeal behind compiling road repair protocols in triplicate a tad dull, but for the Romans, it was a sort of meditative exercise. The meditations, of course, involved long lectures on gravel gradation. A common repair technique was the charmingly named rudus replacement, a process involving lifting a tired section of worn road and relaying the foundational rubble beneath. Lift, refill, tamp down, recite Virgil when bored, then relay the surface stones like puzzle pieces designed by someone who really didn't like corners. And let us not forget the Via Glaria, those charming gravel side streets used as detours while the main road was under repair. These were functional, irritatingly dusty, and often blamed for chariot wheel misalignment. Occasionally, repairs would take a more Roman turn, wherein an entire stretch of road was updated to reflect newer standards, usually after some poor proconsul's cart fell into a ditch and bruised both his shin and his imperial dignity. In such cases, the road might be widened, its drainage improved, and a statue of Victory installed nearby, just to suggest the whole accident was somehow a heroic event. There were also the labourers, the underrated heartbeat of Roman infrastructure, though none had particularly flattering mosaics made of them. These were often enslaved people, but also included paid workers and Roman citizens drafted into civic service. There they toiled with mallets, trowels, and the kind of sunburn that made horses look pale by comparison. Repair zones would be marked with stakes and ropes and patrolled by officials suspiciously enthusiastic about keeping anyone from walking on a half-set section of summum dorsum. That's the top layer of the road, laid with stones so carefully interlocked they could survive centuries of ox carts and dramatic exits by senators. Night work was rare simply because torches lent the work the ambience of a low-budget ghost story. Besides, this was a culture that took daytime very seriously. The sun dictated everything, from bake times for bread to when someone might sensibly declare, "Perhaps we should patch that dangerous sinkhole before a vestal falls in." Road maintenance was so integrated into Roman life that it appeared in literature in satire and occasionally etched into a milestone with a phrase like, "repaired in the third consulship of so-and-so, who also built a fountain and liked figs." A proud declaration, really. In Rome, maintaining the road was akin to maintaining the empire. It was both mundane and sacred, and so, as the day faded and workers packed up their trowels, one could almost hear the rhythmic hush of sand brushing stone, boots shuffling dust, and the whisper of roads waiting patiently to carry tomorrow's footsteps. Ahead lay a tale of tolls and tributes, of who paid for what and why some routes curiously cost an extra coin or two. A fiscal detour through the elegant, if occasionally greedy, layers of Roman logistics, somewhere between the faint croak of distant frogs and the rhythmic scuff of hobnailed sandals on gravel. The Roman Empire continued its slow, remarkably well-paved crawl across continents. And as night deepens across the olive groves of central Italia, let's turn our lantern to yet another unsung hero of the Roman road maintenance machine. The ever-watchful, never-thanked curator viarum, the official road overseer. Think of the curator viarum as the empire's highway whisperer. He didn't wield a shovel, that was beneath him, unlike potholes, which, poetically, were beneath everyone. But he did hold the purse strings, appointed, occasionally reluctantly, by the Senate, often from the ranks of wealthy Roman aristocracy. This chap's job was to inspect and ensure roads were kept in tip-top toga condition. Crack in the paving layer, a stone cylinder mysteriously missing, mudslide from a disgruntled hill. All his problem, theoretically. To help carry the load, not metaphorically, but literally. These overseers employed legions not of soldiers, but of labourers, slaves, and specialized craftsmen called viari. These were your ancient-day town workers, armed with chisels, carts, and an all-too-intimate knowledge of cobblestone alignment. Their unofficial motto might as well have been, "Why sleep when there's gravel to level?" But before sand and sweat met stone, a problem had to be reported. And this is where it gets irresistibly Roman. Ordinary citizens could, in theory, complain about road conditions. However, doing so meant petitioning local magistrates, who were more likely to be preoccupied with bribery, poetry, or digesting a suspicious anchovy. So most complaints came from people the state actually listened to: merchants, Oh yes, merchants, the empire's original Yelp reviewers. If a convoy of olive oil amphorae jostled its way into a crater-sized pothole near Ariminum, you'd better believe the nearest curator virum would soon be receiving a message, perhaps scented with the faint whiff of sesame. We've found graffiti, official decrees, and even letters preserved by volcanic ash that mention failing roads. Some written pleasantries took the form of sarcastic backhanded compliments. To Gaius, overseer of stones, thank you for the road, which has reminded me what falling down feels like after 7 years of walking upright. A little Roman passive aggression, sharper than a centurion's gladius. Now, money, always a sticking point. In an ideal world, maintenance was funded by vectigalia, revenues from things like tolls and taxes. But this being Rome, often the funds mysteriously disappeared, possibly into elaborate feasts starring flamingo tongues and Poseidonic quantities of wine. When that happened, the roads waited, or aristocrats were guilted or publicly shamed into fronting the cost. It became fashionable, embarrassing as it was, to fund a stretch of road repair and inscribe your name along the side. Something like, this half-mile of Via Appia was fixed courtesy of Marcus Petronius, who definitely didn't embezzle anything last Saturnalia. It was charity, with branding. Interestingly enough, maintenance didn't stop at surface level. Beneath the roads ran drainage systems and ditches, periodically cleared out. A clogged ditch might not stir a poet's soul, but it did flood your sandals. So, the curator dispatched crews with long-handled tools and longer-winded complaints to do the filthy work. It said that some ditches were so full of discarded pottery, broken sandals, and chicken bones that they might have qualified as proto-museums, or at least cautionary tales. One curious method of inspection gained traction during the later Republic: the coin test. A silver denarius, wobbling uneasily down the middle of a road, ought to roll smoothly for 20 paces. If it veered off or clinked into a rut before its time, the verdict was failure, and quite possibly someone's polite demotion. Of course, these maintenance routines waxed and waned with the fortunes of the empire. Some decades were a golden age of gravel artistry. Others, well, witnessed goats grazing where paving once lay. But the vision never really died. To the Romans, roads weren't just infrastructure. They were veins in the body politic, sacred threads connecting temple to pasture, port to province, capital to chaos. So next time you dodge a pothole and mutter something heartfelt, spare a dreamlike thought for the Virios, who once filled a rut with hand-mixed mortar at sunset, just east of Lutetia. He may have been sweaty, underpaid, and silently composing oaths in Latin, but by Jupiter, he got the job done. And if you listen very quietly, no, not to the rustling olive trees, down past the hush of cicadas and sleeping columns, you might just hear the creak of a handcart filled with fresh gravel, inching toward tomorrow's job. Speaking of tomorrow, let's follow it quietly down the moonlit Via Flaminia as we drift onward, deeper into slumber, and further into the silent, dusty marvels still to come, somewhere between the plains of Gaul and the mountains of Illyricum, under a sky that probably smelled faintly of olive oil and wet limestone. You could find a group of men doing something deceptively dull, yet vital to the Roman machine. Picture the scene. A trio of Roman road surveyors, their tunics slightly wrinkled, their sandals dusted with the honest grit of empire. One's holding a long staff, another squints through a slightly askew groma, the Roman equivalent of surveying goggles, if your goggles were made of sticks and string. and the third possibly muttering a philosophical aside about how all roads lead to Rome, but only if someone remembers to realign the milestones after a goat knocks them over. You see, once a Roman road was built, and we have already established the sweat-soaked, gravel-packed expense of that, it didn't just stay nice out of gratitude. Nature, that eternal trickster, had other plans. Rain, roots, frost, and the occasional reckless chariot wheel could do as much damage as invading Visigoths. Road maintenance was not a glamorous affair, but it was a necessary one, especially for an empire whose idea of domestic tranquility involved the swift movement of legions and amphorae full of fermented fish sauce. And so, the Romans maintained roads the way some of us maintain our potted herbs, sporadically, with bursts of sudden attention and varying levels of competence. Officially, the duty fell to various levels of local administration. In the Republic, upstanding Roman nobles might generously fund maintenance for the visibility boost, sort of like ancient infrastructure influencers. Later, under the Empire, responsibility passed to curators viarum, men tasked with managing entire road systems. Imagine applying for that job, only to wake up 6 months later waist-deep in basalt cobbles and the crushing awareness that a squirrel-sized pothole near Capua just cost the Empire a whole day's wine shipment. But how did they actually keep the roads going? Here's where the story takes a turn for the charming. It involved actual road crews, teams of labourers, sometimes slaves, sometimes paid workers, trundled out with carts filled with gravel, mortar, and a surprisingly sophisticated toolkit. They carried picks, chisels, and wooden frames to help relay stones neatly. Damaged sections of road were examined, measured, and, whenever possible, patched with suspicious efficiency and Roman stubbornness. Occasionally, inscribed stones told passers-by which governor funded repairs, an early version of your tax dollars at work, albeit with fewer smiling stock images. The Roman comedian Plautus once said that a road knows no modesty, but I suspect he wasn't referring to the curious sight of patched sections looking like poorly sewn toga hems. Still, even in disrepair, Roman roads had a resilience born of good engineering. Multiple layers of stones, gravel, sand, and mortar formed a sturdy base, not unlike your favorite layered dessert, but less edible and significantly worse with honey. And yet, in time, no matter how often the crews trudged out with tar-coated sandals and annoyed glances, the elements always won. Particularly in colder provinces, frost heave darted up through the foundation like a child learning to dance. A violent, unpredictable performance. Then there were the locals. Farmers digging trenches, villagers moving stones for their fences, or opportunistic vendors setting up shop directly atop the road. One can only imagine the curator viarum showing up, ledger in hand, staring blankly at a cabbage stall precisely where a military courier was supposed to thunder through at dawn. Unsurprisingly, some roads fell into what historians gently call disuse, and what Romans probably called something more colourful in Latin. Others were rerouted, especially as towns shifted or trade routes favoured river travel. But even in decline, the bones of the roads remained, silent, steadfast, winding their way through forests, vineyards, and sleepy settlements, long after the empire exhaled its last imperial breath. And so, under the moonlight of memory and moss, a Roman road might appear more eternal than the Caesars themselves, carved through hill and hardship, resilient enough to host wildflowers and time alike. For every pothole patched and every milestone righted, Roman engineers handed us not just a blueprint, but a philosophy. If you're going to pave a path, do it so well that 2 millennia later, someone still mutters your name every time they trip over an ancient paving slab. Next, nestled gently between the clatter of iron nails and the rustle of centurion cloaks, we turn toward the curious lives of toll collectors, those stoic souls who stood not with swords, but with spreadsheets. Figuratively speaking, of course. Roman spreadsheets were mostly on stone. And so, beneath a star-speckled Roman sky, someone's job, uncelebrated yet absolutely essential, was to collect sand. Yes, sand. Not gold, not wine, not falcons trained to fetch scrolls. Sand. You see, while poets and emperors chased immortality with wars and verses, the true heroes of the empire were down by the roadside, kneeling like monks, gathering sand with quiet purpose. Not all roads lead to Rome, but nearly all required regular sand top-ups, particularly in the upper layers of maintenance, known charmingly as summum dorsum, which sounds like it could be a gladiator, but is actually the gravelly top layer of a Roman road. By the time a Roman road was built and blessed by the nearest augur, it looked like the empire's version of an ancient layer cake. A base of large stones, then smaller stones, then gravel, and finally this glamorous finish of tightly packed sand and tiny pebbles, a bit like a shortbread crust. But unlike shortbread, it wasn't meant to crumble. Unfortunately, reality has always had a rather saucy sense of humor, and roads don't stay perfect, particularly not when 12,000 Roman sandals, several goats, a cart full of amphorae, and a disgruntled donkey named Maximus are shuffling over them every day. Sand, though seemingly simple, was Rome's modest magic fix. When ruts began to form, those familiar wheel tracks pressed like wrinkles into an aging face, teams of workers would trudge out with sacks or carts of dry sand. They would tip it generously where needed, smooth it with wooden rakes, and then let the passing traffic tamp it down naturally. No overtime pay, just a bit of sunburn, a lot of patience, and occasional swearing in Latin, which remains one of the most expressive swearing languages ever invented. And now we meet a lesser-known but wholly entertaining figure, the curator viarum, the official in charge of road maintenance, a Roman bureaucrat with the power to govern potholes. Imagine the excitement at dinner parties. So, what do? I rule Via Appia's 3rd mile. Nothing gets past my gravel. Now, a curator virum. Could be a retired general, a city nobleman, or someone with just enough friends in the Senate. Their job? Ensure the roads kept their precious sand, potholes didn't gain sentience, and no one stole paving stones to build an illegal wine cellar, which happened more than you'd expect. Sand delivery was planned not unlike a modern construction site. Teams called viatores travelled stretching routes, reporting areas of need. Materials, gravel, sand, crushed rock, were stored along the way at shaded, organised roadside depots. Not glamorous, but by Roman standards, it was logistical wizardry. These depots may not sparkle in textbooks, but you could spot them by their neat piles and the grizzled workers nearby, often muttering about unpredictable camels or budgets tighter than a senator's toga. Sometimes, local farmers were conscripted into temporary service during peak repair seasons. It was contractually murky but widely accepted. A bit like being suddenly asked to help patch the highway because you happened to own a shovel and bad luck. The sand itself had to meet standards. Roman engineers were nothing if not particular. The wrong grade could gum up the road or wear into dust too quickly. It couldn't be too fine, or the cartwheels would sink. Too coarse, and it wouldn't settle properly. Balance was everything. This obsessive attention to sand quality often led to spirited debates at the site depots, gravel arguments, if you will, with elder workers making passionate, sleep-deprived cases about regional grit. We even have snippets from surviving letters and inscriptions where maintenance crews cursed rains for undoing their hard work, or thanked Jupiter when the sun baked a freshly sanded patch dry and tight before traffic resumed. Oh yes, weather was the great meddler in all Roman maintenance. A strong rain could erode a finish layer in hours, leaving an impromptu obstacle course for travelers. Then, of course, bandits might take advantage of slower travelers tiptoeing around potholes. You'd think the rebels would set up near treacherous bends, but no, they just waited near places with bad sand coverage. Sneaky devils. And so, as the empire carried news, grapes and sandals across the continent, small carts loaded with sand tiptoed behind, keeping everything from literally falling apart. Rome may have had legions, but the sandmen held the cracks together. Now, as the lanterns flicker across the ancient workshops, and the day's final scoop of sand is laid with the same care as the first, let us wander deeper into this world, where the gravel meets the governance, and behind every smooth road lies a story, and probably a donkey named Maximus plotting escape. Somewhere between the ancient cities of Mediolanum and Augusta Treverorum, where Roman road engineers once paused to admire their handiwork while pretending they weren't completely lost, there existed a frequently overlooked, yet crucial, role in the grand machinery of Roman road maintenance, the stone replacer. Yes, while generals marched and emperors schemed, there were men who wandered the roadways not for glory or conquest, but simply to nudge a wobbling cobblestone back into place with a wooden mallet. Imagine the serenity, the sound of sandals crunching gravel, the rhythmic tap of stone meeting mallet, the occasional muttered Latin curse when a toad startled them from beneath a drainage ditch. Stone replacers, based in small outposts known as mansions. Think Roman rest stops with less coffee and more lead piping, were just one cog in the Roman Empire's ceaseless effort to keep pathways from collapsing into ancient pothole chaos. The roads were vital, not just for troops and taxes, but for postal dispatches, olive oil shipments, and that one guy with an urgent need to send his cousin a mildly threatening letter about goat theft. To keep everything in tip-top form, the Romans also employed surveyors, known charmingly as grammatici. These were the philosophical sorts of the road workforce, wandering around with oddly shaped sticks and muttering about angles and shadows. Equipped with a nifty tool called a groma, a cross-shaped apparatus with hanging plumb lines, they plotted perfectly straight lines, even through forests, hills, and the occasional ceremonial burial mound that definitely wasn't pleased about being bisected by Via Flavia. When repairs were needed, letters might flutter along the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, carried by sweaty couriers galloping from one milestone to the next like caffeinated centaurs. Messages would make their way to the local governor, who probably groaned upon reading things like, Section 112 of the Via Aurelia has sunk again. Recommend 3 cartloads of gravel and 1 very apologetic stonemason. But perhaps the greatest unsung heroes of Roman road maintenance were the labourers employed under munera, obligations imposed on local towns. If you were an especially unlucky citizen, you might find yourself drafted for seasonal road cleaning. Picture a grumpy farmer, pitchfork in hand, drafted to shovel goose droppings off the Via Appia while being supervised by a tax collector with an overperforming moustache. Maintenance schedules were sometimes carved into stone stelae, basically ancient whiteboards that couldn't be erased, recording who was responsible for which section. Woe betide the magistrate whose roads went unkept. His political ambitions could sink faster than a poorly drained carriage track. And speak of drainage. Oh, how the Romans loved their drainage. Sloped sides, central stone channels, and carefully placed culverts ensured that a good rain wouldn't turn the road into the Mediterranean's angriest slip and slide. Periodic inspections were held, sometimes by officials known ominously as curatores viarum, or caretakers of the roads, which sounds suspiciously like the title of a supernatural thriller, but was in fact just administrative tedium with sandals. These curatores, usually wealthy men with a love of liss, might travel with a retinue to inspect the roads, document damages, and gently berate anyone who dare let thistles grow through the paving. Their reports might have read something like, gravel heap insufficient, drainage blocked by laurel bush, local goat too belligerent to move. And the roads weren't just for wagons and weary legs. In northern regions, frost heave could crack stones like spines, repairs had to be done quickly, or trade would grind to a halt, and suddenly, no one's getting their jar of salted fish on time. Civitas morale depended on these logistical details. One minor crack in the Via Egnatia could spell a week-long delay in amphorae delivery. And let's face it, nothing sours an imperial gala like lukewarm wine and a missing crate of garum. Even Emperor Hadrian, he of beard and bust fame, personally inspected the roads on occasion. Part vacation, part state tour, part guilt trip aimed at governors. Oh, I see. You've had time to install a new statue of Jupiter, but not to fix this collapsed milestone. Such was the daily, often sleepy rhythm of Roman road maintenance. No great battles, no earth-shaking declarations, just 1,000 men and 1,000 brooms, keeping the empire's arteries clean, stone by stone, sweep by sweep. And as we stroll gently toward the next mile marker, spare a thought for those nameless feet that once paced these dusty stones beneath moonlight and laurel, checking, tapping, aligning, maintaining the longest-running commute in history. Somewhere in the soft lull between the sound of sandals scraping gravel and bureaucrats rustling scrolls, we find ourselves in the offices of the Roman curatores viarum, those stately, sandal-clad overseers of road maintenance, whose job titles were longer than the Via Appia itself. The curator viarum was not merely a guy with a mop and a toga. Oh no, these were high-ranking men, often senators, appointed to keep the roads of the empire functioning like clockwork, or at least like a particularly determined sundial. Their task wasn't just to patch potholes, but to coordinate the labor force, balance impossible budgets, communicate with local magistrates, and occasionally dodge angry mule drivers complaining about too many cobblestones and not enough wine cellars along the way. Now, road maintenance may not sound glamorous, and to be fair, it never was. But within this mundanity lived a rich tapestry of administrative ebb and flow. It was a life filled with spice, mostly because the spice roads needed attention. These curators didn't work alone. They wielded a small army of officials, assistants, inspectors, and a band of builders who looked like they hadn't slept since Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The inspectors were known as mensores, or surveyors, who often traipsed around with long measuring rods, recalculating distances because some small-town mayor insisted the border was definitely 200 paces that way honestly. The mensors maintained equanimity, aided somewhat by the practice of napping under laurel trees until someone shouted, "Alignment check." Where things get delightfully sleepy is within the accounting scrolls. Every road project had to be logged, tallied, estimated in sesterti, and then updated every time someone sneezed and decided to reroute the trade path. There were tables too, called itineraria, which were sort of ancient GPS guides without the passive-aggressive recalculating voice. Every mile had to match roughly with expectations, unless you happen to live in a town with a more creative approach to distance. Now, let's not forget the ever-watchful eye of corruption. Even in ancient Rome, one man's aqueduct repair budget might accidentally end up funding a luxurious new pergola for his summer villa. This, of course, earned stern glances from the Senate, followed by a 12-year audit and a very disappointing invitation to a disciplinary luncheon. But at the heart of it all, the roads were watched with care. Some had milestones, literal stone markers placed at regular intervals. These weren't just helpful navigation tools, they were subtle boasts. This fine road, built under Emperor Titus, was maintained using the sweat of 400 laborers and the groans of 800 oxen. Milestones even listed who paid for the repairs, partly to show civic pride, and partly to ensure future archaeologists, like you, drowsily listening in the 21st century, had something to get excited about. Then there were the viatores, or road messengers, who checked for collapsed bridges, washed away culverts, and the occasional peasant who mistook Roman roads for unusually generous potato beds. Reports would reach the curators in handwritten scrolls, carried by a man on horseback, who may or may not have stopped halfway for olives and gossip. You may be asking, how did Rome manage to keep track of thousands of miles of roads without computers? To which Rome smugly replies, slaves and bureaucracy. A rotating system of duties, taxes, and local obligations provided labor to keep roads alive. If your village fell along an imperial highway, congratulations. Your men were now proud contributors to ditch digging and rock sorting for the greater glory of Rome. Occasionally, maintenance included the dramatic replacement of entire road sections, especially after seasonal floods or overzealous chariot races. And when repairs were completed, it was a momentous occasion. There were sometimes small celebrations with wine, toasting, and the ceremonial placing of a new milestone, which several local children inevitably tried to climb before someone told them to get off the emperor's inscription. So tonight, as you lie back in the warmth of your blankets, your own private villa of softness, imagine the gentle echo of Roman hammers tapping stones into place. Hear the shuffling of scrolls, the mutterings of a worried coordinator wondering if they ordered enough gravel, and know that every road in its way was stitched with a thread of care and ambition, sewn not just for travel, but for legacy. And just ahead, winding around the next sunlit bend, comes a rather curious chapter involving ancient wheel ruts and their dreamy grooves in the dusty heart of the empire. By the time we reach the twilight of the Roman Empire, road maintenance had become something of a tragicomedy, a well-intentioned farce strung together with good ideas, bad funding, and even worse letters to provincial governors. It all started with responsibility, or rather, trying to pass it like a heavy amphora of spoiled fish sauce. In the earlier days, Roman roads were the shining veins of empire, straight, proud, and paved with volcanic ambition. But centuries in, that shine began to dull. Formerly, every magistrate and military engineer couldn't wait to remind you that his stretch of road was smooth enough to roll a wine jar down without so much as a rattle. But now, you'd be lucky if the carts didn't vanish into potholes deep enough to hide a disgraced senator. Technically, the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport service, was supposed to oversee main road upkeep, but the system had grown sluggish, like an elderly tortoise with poor direction. By the late Empire, if a road needed repairs, someone would write a scroll to someone else, who would then forward it, with great ceremony, to someone slightly more important still, who would promptly misplace it under a mound of unread goatskin appeals and poetic eulogies for deceased governors' mothers. Let's linger for a moment inside one of those late Roman road repair appeals. Picture it now. A flustered decurion. Yes, those were town councillors, the bureaucratic glue of local Roman life, standing in his study in Hispania, nibbling the stylus he hasn't properly sharpened in weeks. He's been told by every ox cart driver and freedman grape trader that the local Via Triumphalis is a mess, and the wine shipments keep tipping over backwards, producing an unintentional festival of Dionysian despair. So he sits down and drafts a letter. To His Excellency, the Provincial Administrator of Baetica, would Your Excellency please note the unfortunate condition of the road stretching from Laminium to the river port? Attached are 17 citizen complaints, 4 broken cartwheels, and 1 rather angry mule. His Excellency, of course, promptly scrolls this letter upon arrival, reads the first 2 lines, sneezes into it from the North African dust, and hands it to an assistant named Felix, whose job description is simply find another person to deal with this. Meanwhile, the pothole continues to grow. Local boys begin to dare each other to jump into it. A travelling performer writes an ode to it. A passing bishop blesses it and briefly considers whether it might be deep enough for baptism by full immersion. Maintenance budgets, once held together by taxation, now suffer from that most ancient of economic disruptions, empire-wide inflation and a general sense that the world might be ending soon. So why bother repaving the Appian Way? And then there were the milestones. Ah yes, those proud cylindrical sentinels chiseled with emperor names and mileage, once grand and noble, now slightly sad and leaning like stoic party guests at a banquet that ended 2 reigns ago. Sometimes imperial officials would send auditors to inspect roads. Theoretically, these men would examine culverts, evaluate paving stones, and solemnly nod at drainage ditches. In practice, they often stopped at the nearest villa, were fed roasted dormice and diluted wine, and composed glowing reports by torchlight while reclined on borrowed settees. Of course, in the distant provinces, road maintenance often fell to local communities, the good folks organising ad hoc repair parties, contributing from their own pockets or by hosting raffles. Yes, raffles. Win a goat, patch a road. And in certain corners of the East, one might encounter the Byzantine version of road maintenance, which, to be clear, involves slightly more theology than engineering. If a patch of road was so bad you lost a wheel, it was perhaps God's will. Add a shrine, pray harder, move on. Yet, even through all this gentle disrepair, the roads endured. Worn, yes. Exasperating, certainly. But they still led somewhere. They connected cities and farms, marketplaces and shrines, coastlines and cloud-wreathed fortresses, linking a world that, for all its crumbling certainties, still moved. And there, under moonlight, with the wheels creaking gently along the worn remnants of the empire's arteries, perhaps a weary traveller would look up at the stars and think, not about potholes, but about the sheer grandeur of a people who once believed that the world owed them a straight line to every corner of it, which of course brings us gently forward to what happens when Rome isn't the one patching the roads anymore. By the time the Roman Empire reached its imperial teenage years, moody, sprawling, and overconfident, it wasn't just emperors and armies that kept everything running. It was the unsung bureaucrats who could tell a pothole by smell. Let's drift tonight into the quiet, cobblestone-scented world of the Roman road inspectors, the men who walked the empire not for conquest, but with clipboards made of wax tablets, inspecting gradients and gravel with frankly astonishing solemnity. Yes, the curatores viarum, literally caretakers of the roads. Appointed by the Senate or emperor, and often too wealthy for their own good, these were men who bore great responsibility, mildly uncomfortable sandals, and a fanatical dedication to straight lines. They didn't directly lay stones themselves, heavens no, but they did oversee legions of contractors, suppliers, and laborers. Their work was noble, if not glamorous. After all, no one writes epic poetry about a well-drained ditch. Now picture this: a Roman road stretching arrow-straight for miles across southern Gaul, flanked by dry leaves and distant olive groves. Along it trudges a small procession, a portly curator in a broad-brimmed hat, two assistants with measuring rods, and a rather sulky donkey carrying inspection scrolls, oil for lamp lighting, and perhaps a nice snack for later. The curator stops, squints at a rut in the stone. Something's off. The paving here is slightly, ever so slightly, uneven. He kneels dramatically, taps the stone. He asks his assistant, "When was this last relayed?" The assistant checks his wax tablet, which, to be fair, is more reliable than most medieval popes. 5 years ago, under Marcus Latius. The curator raises an eyebrow. The donkey sighs loudly. After measuring, arguing, and possibly writing a strongly worded note to Marcus Latius for using substandard pozzolanic mortar, they move on. You see, Roman roads weren't just built, they were curated like museum exhibits. There were layers, literal and administrative. Underneath the roads lay foundations of stone and compacted earth, while above them oaths were sworn, budgets negotiated, and officials dispatched with alarming frequency to inspect their condition. If a road was in poor shape, and it wasn't due to rampaging Visigoths or one too many wine carts, someone was going to get a bureaucratic finger wagged in their direction. Not all penalties were severe. Mismanagement could be forgiven with the right bribe or display of civic generosity. Perhaps a cheerful statue of Mercury at the crossroads, or even a public bath refurbishment. But while wealthy cities could afford the pomp of perfect paving, poorer regions relied on local landowners and civic-minded volunteers, or a group that sounds like something from a toddler's fable, the vieri privati. They were private citizens who took it upon themselves to repair bits of road, whether for pride, posterity, or just because they were tired of tripping over stones on their morning strolls. These citizens sometimes funded small repairs along lesser-used routes. In exchange, they got a nice inscription at roadside saying something like, "Lucius Cornelius fixed this bit, you're welcome." Even the gladiators got in on the act sometimes. When they weren't busy being dramatically stabbed for public entertainment, some left parts of their winnings to fund road repair. Nothing says legacy quite like Julius the Unbeaten, master of the sand, fixer of the asphalt. Labour, of course, didn't come from nowhere. Convicts, enslaved people, and tired oxen did the dusty, blistering work of resurfacing. Sometimes soldiers were pulled from duty to patch roads, grumbling no doubt, but likely happy to be wielding a pickaxe instead of dodging Parthian arrows. One centurion even wrote in a surviving letter, "I'd rather patch roads for a year than spend another day marching through Dacia barefoot." A strong review. despite it all, some roads flourished through sheer stubbornness. The Via Appia, Rome's oldest daughter, remained a regal ribbon of stone lined with tombs and history, regularly maintained by a rotating cast of curators, contractors, and disapproving grandmothers muttering about that one bump outside the bakery. And like any proper maintenance culture, there were debates, heated ones. Philosophers argued whether a slightly uneven road might cause moral decay. Satirists joked that every new Roman governor declared a war on road wear, only to run out of funds once they paved the bit near their own villa. Even road quality disputes occasionally made it into court records. Nothing says peak civilization like suing your neighbor over drainage rights. And so, lulled by stone and supervision, we walk ever further down this infinite Roman highway, not toward glory or triumph, but to the next slightly cracked paving stone and the officials who loved it too much. Somewhere ahead, under a warm Italian moon, a squad of municipally funded lantern bearers prepares to inspect a culvert, but all in due time. For now, let the road rest beneath your feet, and we shall carry on very gently from here. As dust settles across the dusty hills of the Roman provinces, let us drift together into the blissfully mundane world of mutationes. Roadside rest stops, the unsung heroes of the Roman road network, and perhaps the ancient world's first answer to that ageless travel dilemma. Where on earth can I use the loo? These weren't the flashy roadside inns you might imagine from a toga-clad travel brochure. Mutationes, from the Latin root mutare, to change, were simple outposts where weary messengers, soldiers, and dignitaries could swap out exhausted horses for fresher ones. Think of it as Rome's imperial Uber Light, sans snacks, and with a lot more grunting involved. Mutationes were spaced every 8 to 12 Roman miles apart. That's roughly 12 to 18 kilometers for those of us using a less mathematically nightmarish system. The distances weren't random. This was engineered with equine endurance in mind. Rome was many things, but above all, practical. They calculated how far a government courier, strapped with a wax tablet and a grim sense of urgency, could ride before the horse gave him the imperial side-eye. And that, dear listener, is how standardization galloped into infrastructure. These humble stops often included a stable, a basic shelter, and a drinking trough spacious enough to double as a cold plunge for road-weary sandals. Occasionally, a little well or a small supply of food. Basics like bread, olives, maybe even some cheese, if the inflation wasn't too aggressive that decade. Technically, they weren't intended for civilians, but wink, local farmers and traveling merchants often formed quiet understandings with attendants, trading a fresh wheel of pecorino for an hour's shelter or a place to dream about citizenship. The men who staffed these mileposts were part of the cursus publicus, the Roman state's postal and transport service. Now, when you think postal worker, you might not immediately picture someone in a tunic, holding eagle insignia credentials and cursing in Latin at an overflowing amphora of provincial messages. But these couriers were crucial threads in Rome's administrative fabric, guaranteeing that complaints from Gaul could reach the ears of someone very bored in the Curia Julia. Now, don't confuse mutationes with their slightly fancier cousin, the manzio. If mutationes were the roadside lemonade stands, mansions were the countryside Airbnbs, official lodging stations for those with higher status or deeper bureaucratic clout. They offered food, a place to sleep, and sometimes even bars. Yes, Roman roads came with built-in spa options. Baths, because even when marching to suppress a rebellion, it's important to exfoliate. The roads themselves were nothing if not enthusiastic about stopping at regular intervals. Along well-trafficked routes, you could practically tick off the empire by the smell of fresh dung at each resting post. Horses came in, horses went out, riders stretched, squatted, sneezed. A ballet of maintenance in motion. In terms of logistics, mutaciones were marvels of pre-modern supply chain thinking. Local municipalities were often responsible for staffing and upkeep, which meant small towns turned these stations into miniature hubs of economy and obligation. Occasionally, emperors issued edicts punishing negligence. If the horses weren't fresh, or the stables were filthy, you could be fined or, worse, receive a sternly worded scroll. Nothing strikes terror into the heart of a Roman contractor like a scroll delivered at dinner time. Archaeologists today often identify mutaciones from ruins of rectangular enclosures and telltale stabling facilities, though some are merely hinted at by worn travel routes and a suspiciously horse-sized pile of something decidedly not volcanic ash. In the twilight hush of Rome's logistical symphony, these outposts played their own tiny notes, uncelebrated, unadorned, but completely essential to how news traveled, armies moved, and sandals shuffled from one dusty province to another. We rarely think of empire as something that smells like manure and warm hay, but perhaps we should. So next time you're stuck at a gas station, listening to a thrum of vending machines and half-hearted music, think of the courier in Britannia dismounting in the drizzle, exchanging beasts, and setting off again. Saddle sore but efficient, the steady hum of empire beneath his leather soles. And just as his horse's hoofbeats fade into the damp horizon, we too can let our breathing slow, preparing for our final stroll along the flagstones. A quiet denouement awaiting ahead, paved most assuredly by Roman hands. By now, you're lying still, perhaps only half conscious, with your mind drifting somewhere between the Via Appia and a pile of freshly mixed Roman cement. But before we let this story sail off into your subconscious, like a sleepy Roman barge down the Tiber, there's one final charming detail to tuck under your metaphorical pillow. Let's take a moment to appreciate the unsung heroes of Roman road maintenance, the curatores viarum. These officials were appointed, sometimes with great fanfare, sometimes with a resigned shrug, to oversee the condition and repairs of Rome's vast network of roads. Imagine them in their togas, one part noble administrator, one part exasperated highway inspector, forever trying to stretch imperial funds over thousands of rutted miles, a logistical lullaby, if there ever was one. These curatores didn't only inspect roads. No, they coordinated legions of workers, managed budgets stuffed with temple donations, toll revenues, and occasional bribes, or, as Romans likely called them, expedited civic encouragements. They'd inspect bridges, re-evaluate milestones, and occasionally commission those famous inscriptions we still find today. Great stone blocks announcing that Marcus Fabius, son of Marcus Fabius, patrolled this road and found it acceptable. Please stop stealing the paving stones. Maintenance crews, known less poetically as road gangs, were sometimes made up of soldiers, slaves, or contracted labourers. Armed with chisels, gravel carts, and an abiding sense of duty, or perhaps just fear of the overseer's glare, they repaved surfaces stone by stone. Repairing a Roman road was rarely glamorous work. It was sticky under a Mediterranean sun, muddy in Gallic winters, and always underfunded. Still, despite the challenges, Roman roads demonstrated an unexpected trait. They aged gracefully. Even a damaged Roman road aged like an unbothered aristocrat, cracked at the edges but still keeping its dignity. In fact, parts of the Via Appia are used even today, which makes the potholes on your local street feel a bit more personally offensive, doesn't it? Romans were also masters of setting boundaries, especially when it came to preserving road space. Landowners who encroached upon the road right-of-way could find their freshly built walls removed, brick by government order. The same orders rarely applied to goats, which continued to wander where they pleased, nodding cryptically at passers-by like ancient philosophers with hooves. As the empire aged, however, maintaining this grand network proved increasingly difficult. During the later imperial period, funding tangled in bureaucracy, and fewer people wished to pay for road repairs. Even fewer wanted to supervise them. By the 4th century, emperors were issuing desperate edicts like, "Please someone, literally anyone, fix the road to Capua." But the curatores had largely gone home, possibly with a box of leftover marble tiles and one last defiant shrug. And yet, the roads endured, not just physically, but as a concept. The Roman road was more than stone. It was a sentence written across the landscape, a quiet declaration that humans could impose order, however briefly, on the wild curves of nature. Even in disrepair, even covered in moss and miraculously occupied by chickens, they whispered something ancient. The empire was here. It moved. It built. It left behind a path. So as the stars fade over the old empire, and your mind meanders gently along those ancient starlit highways, up stone-paved hillsides and through sleepy market towns lined with flickering oil lamps, remember that every road begins with intention and ends with a very old pair of sandals tossed in the ditch. You've wandered far tonight, past surveyors with crooked plumb lines, through debates over drain gradients, and into the patient rhythm of Roman routine. The roads, like time, were meant to carry us, all of us, a little farther. Now, let the heavy gates of the city close for the night, the torchlight dim behind temple columns, and the footsteps of tired travelers fade into the hush of distant olive groves. Sleep well, little road worker of dreams. Tomorrow, we rest.